Facebook has studied a pattern that they call problematic use, what we might more commonly call addiction.
Frances Haugen has been inside the beast, working as a data scientist at Facebook before turning whistleblower in 2021, revealing the company's dirty secrets.
Recently, 44 states sued Meta for lying to the public about public safety, like knowingly harming children and then telling the public, oh, nothing's wrong, which is exactly the same playbook that Big Tobacco played in the United States for decades. In the filings, they had excerpts from conversations by Meta's own employees where they said to each other, we are the tobacco companies.
Frances believes Meta will dig its heels in, and rather than pay good money for news content produced by other companies, will instead ban Australian news from your Facebook feed altogether. It's already done just that in Canada after they followed our lead and passed a tough media bargaining code.
And what Meta is saying right now is they're unwilling to even have a conversation. You know, they're just going to opt out. They're just going to remove the news.
This has left a void on these two big platforms, on Facebook and on Instagram.
Alfred Hamida is a journalist and professor in Canada.
For nearly 9 months now, Canadians have had no news from news organizations, be they large media or local startups on Facebook or Instagram.
He sees a problem with viewers who've been groomed to glance across Facebook for their news, only to now receive unregulated content that could be inaccurate or just made up.
Potentially, you could also see with elections coming up in the US and other countries, they would be facing a huge challenge in terms of misinformation and potentially AI-generated misinformation.
Meta has turned off news in Australia before, for 8 days back in 2021.
Breaking news now, developing story this morning. Facebook has stopped its Australian users from accessing news sites.
In the process, it also cut off Australian emergency organisations and charities, causing a huge backlash and forcing them to turn news back on.
Facebook has refriended Australia, and Australian news will be restored to the Facebook platform.
From 2013 to 17, Stephen Sheila ran Facebook in Australia and New Zealand for Mark Zuckerberg. Like Francis, his instincts tell him Facebook is on the brink of blocking news.
From what I've seen, what's happened in Canada, some other markets, from what I've heard, I think they have decided that news is not an important part of the future of Meta and social media. There's a line where you need to pay for it. Facebook's saying, well, we'll go on the other side of that line so that we don't have to pay for it. They've come to a decision that this just is too much trouble. Let's turn this off.
If they turn off news, that's probably the worst outcome for Australia. Means less stories, particularly local stories, less promotion of local businesses, less scrutiny of local councils, less community information at a hyper-local level.
That's a real concern, I think, for Australia and Australian society.
Former head of the ACCC, Rod Sims, agrees it was his investigation 4 years ago that led to the media bargaining code.
Media is the fourth estate. To have large platforms deciding they won't show news, I think is something the government needs to think about whether they'll find acceptable or not.
These big tech giants are almost like nation states in themselves. They have that kind of power. And it's very hard for somewhere like Canada, potentially for somewhere like Australia, to really force these platforms to do what is best for society, which would be carry news on their platforms.
You've testified that Facebook puts, in your words, astronomical profits ahead of people. Do you still stand by that?
Let's do for easy math, 20 million Australian users. Let's say every year they make at least $150. It's probably more. That adds up to billions and billions and billions of dollars in revenue just off of Australians.
Their last accounts in Australia, they reported approximately $1.2 billion of revenue. The ACCC in its report estimated it to be between $4.2 and $5.3 billion.
And despite that enormous revenue, Meta works hard to make sure it pays minimal tax here. In fact, in 2021, it paid $24 million tax in Australia. The year before, even less, as it sends hundreds of millions of dollars back to its parent company overseas. Leaked information shows its deals to pay local media companies for news content was set up not with Facebook in Sydney, but with Facebook in Ireland, where their corporate tax rate is less than half of ours.
They operate at enormous scale, and therefore the ability to be able to reasonably negotiate with them commercially is very difficult in a relatively small market like Australia versus the rest of the world.
And they point blank refused to negotiate, contrary to the laws of the Australian Parliament.
Is Mark Zuckerberg a digital dictator?
In our experience the past week, yes. He said that there are no terms, there is no negotiation, and will continue to take your content.
It's not an overstatement to say that he's a digital dictator. He has the majority of shares of control in his company. No one can remove him except for basically his own bad behavior. He became the CEO of Facebook when he was 19 years old. He has been surrounded by people who just tell him what he wants to hear ever since. You know, he's about to turn 40. That's half his life he's spent in an echo chamber.